Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. As Emma said, my name is Brendan Freeman, and I oversee the work programme for the Natural Environment and Agriculture within the Adaptation Secretariat of the Committee on Climate Change. Today, together with my colleague Olivia Shears, I was going to provide you with a very high-level overview of findings from our most recent assessment of adaptation progress, published back in March, I think it was, specifically for England. And I was going to give a specific focus on our assessment of nature-based solutions to support adaptation within urban environments. Now, there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentations, although feel free to add them in the chat and I'll try and respond to them. So in terms of the structure of the presentation, I thought I'll give you a quick overview of the reporting process and talk about the approach to scoring. Then I'll go into a bit more depth around the high-level findings and the actual specific risks that we assess for towns and cities. Then Olivia will look a bit more in terms of the scoring for the towns and cities system. And then I was going to conclude by providing a quick overview of some nature-based solution types within urban areas. So the types of things that we're looking for as part of local plans. Before I do, though, I thought it would be a good idea if I gave you a little background as to the reporting responsibilities of the Adaptation Committee. So under the UK Climate Change Act, we have two statutory functions. The first is to produce a UK level assessment every 5 years of the latest evidence on the priority risks to the UK from climate change that require immediate action. The government then responds with the National Adaptation Programme, which outlines the plans and actions that will be implemented in England and across the devolved administrations to address the urgent risks that we've identified. That brings me to the second statutory function, which is to produce a report for England, scrutinising the government's progress in adapting to climate change. And we assess that in from two angles. Firstly, we assess the plans and actions that are committed to within the National Adaptation Plan and their effectiveness and extent to which they've been delivered. And then secondly, looking at how those plans and actions have actually reduced vulnerability to climate change, and we draw on an extensive range of indicators in order to do that. We do have non-statutory responsibilities for the devolved administrations as well. So this year we've been commissioned to produce 4 reports for each of the DAs in England, so it's been quite a busy year. Now, in terms of the approach we take, so we took a slightly different method this time around. So in the past, we had a long list of indicators that we assessed when we were looking at the effectiveness of these plans. However, it really was just a long list of indicators without really much context to them. So we've tried to make them more applied, and we've developed what we've called monitoring maps. And just very quickly, 4 different elements to these monitoring maps. First is we look to identify a goal for a specific system. So, for instance, for towns and cities, what type of vision are we looking at for adaptation? Then we look at a range of different sub-outcomes for that. So for towns and cities, it could be reducing excess deaths, or, for instance, the delivery of nature-based solutions within towns and cities, etc. We also look at enabling factors. So these aren't necessarily adaptation actions, but there'll be things such as financing in place, skills and capacity of different organisations in order to adapt to climate change. And then also we look at the types of policy gaps that we need to provide recommendations against, which need to be filled in order to deliver the overall goals. We also include contextual factors, so things such as climate events, which aren't within our control. There'll be more on the mitigation side, but even so, provide them just to kind of highlight the urgency of the work we're doing. So we developed monitoring maps for each of the 13 systems that we looked at, and these systems look at a range of different areas. So the natural environment, they will be looking at infrastructure, business and finance, people in the built environment, and also natural environments. And of these systems, we have nature, working land and seas, so looking at the key sectors that are dependent on those services, food security, we look at water supply, energy systems, telecoms, transport, towns and cities. I won't go through the whole lot, but we'll go through the specific ones in more detail through Olivia's slides. But I think I'll skip that in just mindful of time. Now, in terms of the actual approach that we take the framework that we look at is a two-part approach. The first part looks at the policies and plans in place, mainly at a national level, but we're trying to look more at a more local level now, so it'll be particularly relevant to today's session. And then the second part is looking at a range of different indicators to look at the extent of delivery of the plan, of the actions within the plans, and also the effectiveness of those actions. And that's a particularly difficult area to identify because you're talking about linking clearly a specific action to reducing vulnerability, and there's lots of different factors such as land use change and population change which are all mixed in. Okay, so in terms of policies and plans, I guess the first thing we look at is there a plan? Secondly, does it account for current climate change, and does it account for future climate change as well, so 2 and 4 degree scenarios? Does it include a set of effective actions? And I guess most importantly, are there targets in place and monitoring and evaluation frameworks that can support assessment against progress towards those targets? In terms of delivery, so the second part will look at how the risk is being managed, and that's the outer ring on the figure on the right. So we're looking at how vulnerable systems are to climate change and how this vulnerability is changing before and after actions have been delivered, and where robust adaptations aren't available. Unfortunately, we can only score it as unable to evaluate. And as you'll see later, for many of the systems that we've looked at, there's a real gap in terms of the level of data that we would need in order to conduct a robust assessment. Okay, so just getting into the findings from the report itself. So I can't go into too much detail. Olivia will do that, but at the very highest level, across the 13 different systems, I guess it was a mixed bag of progress. So I say when assessing the plans, there are provisions, or there is greater consideration of adaptation within existing plans, which is good to see, although some sectors are more advanced than others. So if we're looking at the water supply sector, their plans are pretty robust, take into account future climate change, have a set of actions, etc. But when we're looking at other systems such as for agriculture or forestry, not so much, and there is kind of more progress to be made. In terms of effectiveness of management, I guess the main concern is that of the indicators that we do have access to, and in some cases this is very little, there is very limited signs of tangible progress in reducing risks and exposure. And as I say, in far too many cases, the absence of relevant, robust data remains a key barrier to us conducting a thorough assessment of progress. Now, this can be seen by the blue marks, or the blue outer circles in there. You can see for many of the actual systems, we just don't have any data to assess that, which is unfortunate, but it has been reflected in the recommendations to government that we've provided in the report. Okay, so Olivia is going to talk you through the progress assessment specifically for towns and cities in a second, but before she does, I just thought it would be a good idea to kind of frame the session a bit to assess more specifically which type of risks we have identified in our climate change risk assessment for urban and suburban areas. So across the evidence that we assessed, the key risks that have been identified for towns and cities were heat waves, river and surface water flooding, and flooding resulting from sea level rise. So in terms of heat waves and generally higher temperatures, as we saw in the 2018 heat wave, the impact of that, projections show that the chances of another event such as that will increase from a 20% chance currently to a 1 in 2 chance by 2050 under current projections. So the prevalence of heat absorbing land surfaces such as pavements and buildings make towns and cities particularly exposed to higher temperatures, so things such as the urban heat island effect. In terms of river and surface water flooding, so due to the projected increase in the amount of rain, particularly in winter, and also the intensity of rainfall, that has increased the risks significantly, and also exacerbating the problem is the development on floodplains, which has largely gone unchecked up to now. Finally, in terms of sea level rise, so within the CCRA, we noted that across the UK, the sea level index suggests that sea levels have risen by between 1.2 and 1.6 millimetres per year since 1901, and coastal towns and cities are at high risk of flooding due to the added risk of sea level rise. There's also around 1,800 kilometres of open coastal areas in England, which are also at risk of erosion. So sea level rise will worsen erosion rates due to the higher nearshore water depths. So that's provided just a quick overview of the types of risks that we've assessed for towns and cities. I'm going to hand over to Olivia now that will provide you some of the high-level findings specifically for towns and cities.
Yeah, thank you, Brendan. So I'm just going to jump kind of straight in with focusing on 2 of those monitoring maps. So on the left of the slide here, we have the towns and cities monitoring map and the kind of top level outcomes that Brendan mentioned. And on the right, we have the nature monitoring map. And I've highlighted in red a kind of area of overlap between the 2, which looks at using nature recovery and nature-based solutions as part of adaptation in urban areas. And this feeds in kind of as a specific outcome in the nature monitoring and kind of what we believe leads to a well-adapted natural system, but it also feeds into several of the outcomes of the towns and cities monitoring map, highlighting the role that nature-based solutions must play in adapting to climate risks in urban areas. And so this means things like reducing the extent of impermeable surfaces, installing sustainable drainage, and managing flood risk via natural flood management. So we're looking at achieving risk reduction whilst also forwarding environmental aims and outcomes for biodiversity and environmental quality. And within these monitoring maps, if we just flick to the next slide, please, Brendan. So this kind of zooms in specifically on the towns and cities one. You can see how they're structured. So we have a top level kind of overarching aim and goal, and then these required outcomes, and the italic bullet points under each of the required outcomes are these indicators that Brendan mentioned that we're looking at to measure progress. And an overall summary of the indicators for the kind of role of nature-based solutions in towns and cities will fall into some of these bullet points below. So within the town and city system, as to focus on those risks that Brendan talked about, we have the specific outcomes to look at river and coastal flooding, but also surface water flooding, recognising that that's a kind of separate set of interventions required to do with drainage as much as maybe defences. And then there's also a kind of outcome for sustainable coastal change management and urban heat risk. And then below that, we have the idea that there's actually all of these actions are underpinned by a functioning or planning system which functions for climate resilience. And there's kind of several specific indicators which we use to track whether the planning system is considering, or current national planning policy is considering climate change sufficiently. So the sort of indicators that we are looking at, things like the number of homes better protected, the number of SUDS installations, planning permissions granted against EA advice, Yeah, and I'll come onto these in the next slide a little bit more. So an overall sort of assessment of the indicators towards progress for the built environment, and this is specifically looking at that nature-based solution kind of side, is that we really lack data to assess progress for adapting to these risks in towns and cities at the national scale. And there are some examples of like really good local practice at local scales, and we know that lots of interventions are being delivered at local scales, but the national scale level, the national level picture is still pretty patchy. For example, the Greater London Authority have a really good SUDS database, and so things like that is something that we are kind of encouraging through our report, or encouraging policy to provide a mechanism to better record data. I think an important point for some of the context, an important point is that these indicators need context. So you say it's kind of, there's no national scale monitoring of urban green infrastructure or canopy cover at the moment, and we're sort of lacking a baseline at currently, but in the future I think it's important that these indicators reflect not just kind of how many installations, but where they are and how that maps to risk, and what kind of quality or maintenance or type of infrastructures these are. But yeah, at the moment there's still a kind of lack of data in general across this piece. And on the planning side and adapting to risks in the built environment, the indicators which we did have were actually showing negative trends, or not positive trends, definitely. So new development is continuing to be built in the floodplain, and urban extent is increasing, and the proportion of green and blue space is decreasing at a national scale. So this led to the planning required outcome being ranked as insufficient progress. Do you want to move to the next slide, please?
A couple more minutes, Olivia, all right?
Yes, yeah. And so this is the policies and plans row of the monitoring map. We have the, we kind of grouped policies and plans for all of the sectors under these different titles of legislation, standards, financial instruments, and information and reporting. And I've kind of highlighted the key sort of themes for enabling nature-based solutions in the built environment, and the key relevant sort of parts maybe for delivery of adaptation. So the things that we've sort of recommended are mandatory adaptation measures in new developments, standards for those adaptation measures such as sustainable drainage and nature-based solutions, and I think that comes with clear guidance to delivery bodies for how they should be managed and installed. But then also this kind of key part of the puzzle really is that national government policy should incentivise private sector investment, or incentivise new and retrofit adaptation projects within the built environment. And then this final point that Brenda's already mentioned, that this all has to be accompanied by ongoing monitoring, and so that needs to be driven from policy at some point in the cycle. Have the next slide, please, Brendan. So just a really quick assessment of our kind of final policies assessment for towns and cities. We said there were credible plans for river and sea flooding and limited plans for surface water flooding, recognising recent progress in the implementation of Schedule 3. But there's still some gaps in Schedule 3, so how it's going to be funded, where are the standards and regulation. The bit that kind of didn't do as well in the policies and plans was looking at urban planning policy, which I mentioned, and also urban heat risks, where we sort of said that national policy doesn't sufficiently support climate resilience in local plan making, and there's a lack of vision, particularly for urban heat. But there are some opportunities through things like biodiversity net gain and green infrastructure frameworks. Next slide, please. And so then just really quickly kind of bring it down to the local level. I think I just wanted to highlight a couple of kind of key things which are relevant at regional scales and kind of actually delivering adaptation. So there's the actions, which we've talked about, and I think which Brendan will come on to slightly in the final slide, of just kind of green infrastructure. Impermeable surfaces is a really big one, and how we manage that going forward. So stopping people paving over drives and householder decisions on what they do with their gardens and things like that. But then also urban heat, again, considering how we begin to start to manage that through traffic and building and putting in shading and cooling centres. And this also links to another chapter in the report, which is the response chapter. So that's things like evacuation plans, cooling centres. But probably sort of another side of the relevant area of that is the need for funding and financing, engaging communities, and continuing this kind of monitoring and evaluation piece of collecting data and supporting innovative approaches to finance and empowering communities to kind of maintain nature and raise awareness about the multiple benefits of nature-based solutions. Yeah, that was a quick summary.
Brilliant.
I'm conscious we're running over considerably, so did you want us to pause there? There's only just one slide, Emma.
Do you want to wrap it up in sort of 60 seconds? That would be great.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so just to give you a more tangible idea of what we're talking about when we're referring to nature-based solutions, going by the types of risks. So key risks for towns and cities, if we talk about extreme heat, things such as planting of trees and greater prevalence of vegetation to help cool the local climates, and also green corridors for better ventilation. In terms of drought and water scarcity, just ensuring we have natural permeable surfaces and water bodies to help store water locally. Wildfire risk is an increasing risk, so making sure that natural environments are in a good condition, and we also use less flammable species in those plantations, and also making sure we have local wildfire response plans and sufficient capacity in terms of firefighting services. Flooding, the use of sustainable drainage systems has proven very effective to reduce and store stormwater runoff, and also things such as riparian buffer strips, so planting of trees along rivers, etc., to stop coastal erosion. And then finally, coastal flooding, just making sure we have more natural black barriers, coastal realignments, so making sure we have a buffer between the actual city and a natural buffer to that and the oceans. I guess if I was to conclude on one message, it is that we know there's a lot of good work going on. It's just the lack of data means that we're unable to assess the extent and the effectiveness of that. So if there's any support that you can provide in helping us with that, that would be very much appreciated. Okay, thank you very much.